They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians in your foolish police call the Axman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, and the worst, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fancy. The Axman. Hi, welcome to True Crime and Coke. I am your host, Eve. This podcast is about true crime, disappearances, hauntings, and anything strange or unusual. I also drink a whole bunch of Diet Coke and pronounce most things wrong. If you would like to support my Coke habit, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Please check out my YouTube page and email me any stories at truecrimeandcoke@gmail.com. So, let's get started. This letter addressed from the hottest hell to the esteemed mortals of New Orleans on March 13th, 1919, reminds me of a very celebrated Bible story. As the story goes, during the 10th and final plague, God passes through the land of Egypt and strikes down the firstborn of every household. But the Jews were forewarned to mark their doors with the blood of a lamb they've sacrificed, the Passover offering, and so God passes over their homes, sparing the firstborn son, just as the Axeman spared the lives of the citizens in New Orleans who played jazz on that Tuesday night of March 18th, 1919. There are many myths about the Axeman of New Orleans, but only a few facts are known. What is known is there was a killer in the early 1900s operating in the New Orleans area, nearly 30 years after the forever infamous Jack the Ripper slaughtered East London prostitutes, sent letters to the papers, and caused widespread panic. This killer, labeled as America's own Bayou Jack the Ripper, or more infamously known as the Axman of New Orleans, provoked more fear than Jack the Ripper. Why? Because Jack the Ripper murdered prostitutes on the streets, but the Axman of New Orleans' victims could be a man, woman, or even a child. His MO was to chisel out a door panel to access the internal lock and use an axe, already on the property, to attack his sleeping victims. He'd leave behind the weapon as he left the scene. Sometimes he demanded money and went through belongings, but rarely took anything of value. He seemed to target small business owners of Italian descent who often lived in townhomes that connected to their business. Another known fact is that no esteemed mortal of New Orleans was murdered, at least not by axe, that following Tuesday night after the letter was printed. The night was described as very loud, crowded, and busy. Thousands of homes blasted jazz music loud enough to be heard by any passerbys, or passing murderers too, I suppose. Jazz clubs and dance halls were overflowing with people listening to jazz, whether being a fan or not. So, who was the Axman of New Orleans that forewarned the city's citizens that listening to jazz on the night of Tuesday, March 18th, 1919, would ensure their safety from his axe? The answer is not clear. There are varying dates as to when the murders started, or if some murders were even related. There are varying theories on who his victims were and why, varying suspicions of who the Axeman was, varying conspiracies, one being jazz-related, and that the letter was never written by the killer himself. So, forget depictions of the Axeman of New Orleans from shows like American Horror Story and many others, as they couldn't be further from the truth. I will tell you the true story, and it is quite complex, but I will try to give you as much relevant detail about this unsolved case in a way that will make sense, tie everything together, and not take several hours to tell. The first episode will be about the attacks and murders committed and possibly committed by the Axman of New Orleans. Episode 2 will go into suspects and theories as to why the Axman came to be. Before I begin, I need to brief you about some history of New Orleans that sets the stage for the early 1900s, when the brutal crimes began. In the mid-1800s, the highest concentration of millionaires in America could be found between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Their wealth came largely from sugarcane plantations, which depended on the labor of thousands of slaves. The large slave plantations were broken up after the North's victory in the Civil War in 1872, when the Union took hold of Louisiana. This allowed the newly freed men the choice to stay or to go, and many chose to leave. Plantation owners panicked and thought, "Oh crap, we need cheap laborers to work our plantations. What are we going to do?" Desperate for cheap labor, on March 17, 1866, the Louisiana Bureau of Immigration was formed, and plantation owners began to look to Sicily as a possible solution to their labor needs. Steamship companies' advertisements were a success and recruited workers from Sicily. 3 steamships per month were running between New Orleans and Sicily by September 1881 at a cost of only $40 per person. Post-Civil War, the city's demographics completely changed. Thousands of African Americans from other places also poured into the city, living with whites, Creoles, Jewish people, and now add to that an abundance of Italians. By 1918, 1919-ish, this mixing of cultures brought with it a new type of music called jazz. To some extent, jazz was heading in the opposite direction of segregation, which was trying to separate people. At that time, the young people of New Orleans gravitated to jazz and the blues, and it seems so did the Axman. I also need to bring up some specific history about the Italians. Plantation owners who employed the Italian laborers had a problem. The Italians would save money, then better themselves. One of the most common pathways for a Sicilian laborer in New Orleans was from plantation worker to truck farmer and peddler to grocer. Small Italian-owned businesses sprung up all over Louisiana. By 1900, New Orleans had the largest Italian community in the South. About 20,000 Italians lived in the French Quarter, which was by now the oldest and most run-down section of the city. So many Sicilians lived in the lower French Quarter that it was known as Little Palermo. I don't think I'm going to be casted for any parts in any Italian films. Italians never entirely replaced black labor, but worked alongside them in the fields. While the Italians thought nothing of this, many Southern white people found their willingness to do so made them no better than, and I quote, Negroes, Chinese, or other non-white groups. The Sicilians were often considered not white at all and nothing but black Dagos. The Sicilian immigrants brought something with them to New Orleans as well, the vendetta, which is a clannishness and distrust of the authorities that led them to settle their disputes the old-fashioned way. This system of justice survived in Sicily into the 20th century. It was quite the norm for the Sicilian immigrants to vendetta both personal and professional matters. So many shootings and knife fights occurred along Decatur Street that it was nicknamed Vendetta Alley. They also brought a type of extortion known as Black Hand crime, which is when a victim was threatened with violence if the money demanded wasn't paid. The fear of immigrant crime was full-blown in 1890 to 1891 with the murder of the Irish New Orleans Chief of Police David Hennessy. On the night of October 15, 1890, he arrived home only to be greeted by multiple bullets. As he died, Chief Hennessy insisted, "The Dagos got me." New Orleanians found it easy to believe that Hennessy's murder was connected to organized Italian criminal gangs that press often referred to as the Mafia. The use of the term Mafia by local media in relation to the murder is the first known usage of this word in print. The police arrested a number of Sicilians who were to be tried in two groups. But after several acquittals, a mob stormed the jail, murdering 11 of the accused Sicilians. The mob lynched some who'd been acquitted, as well as some who had yet to be tried. So, as you can imagine, the tension was high. But the Italians continued with success despite the prejudices faced, and by 1920, they ran fully half of all groceries in the city. Okay, students of this podcast, history class is over, and I promise that this will all be relevant later on in the episode. Now it's time for Murders in New Orleans 101. The first attack that most people actually attribute to the Axman of New Orleans was Joseph Maggio, aged 41, and his wife Catherine, aged 36. Joseph was an Italian grocer and bar owner, and he and his wife lived in a small apartment that was attached to his store. Joseph also had two brothers that lived in attached apartments, Jake and Andrew. In the early hours of August 10th, 1918, the couple was sleeping in their beds when a man broke into their home and crept into their bedrooms. He then slashed their throats and then struck their heads with an axe several times. The killer then went into the bathroom, changed into clean clothes, and fled, leaving the blood-stained clothes behind. Brother Jake awoke
after he heard loud groaning coming from his brother's house. He woke up Andrew, and the two brothers went to go check on their brother Joseph and his wife. The first thing that caught their eye was a panel had been removed from the door. This was remarkable in the fact that they remembered that the panel was there the night before when they were over for dinner. They entered the house slowly. The door led into the kitchen, then a hallway. In the hallway were two rooms on the left, a bathroom and the couple's bedroom. Once in the bedroom, they were confronted with a brutal scene. There was blood everywhere. Catherine's dead body was draped over Joseph, who was surprisingly still alive. They noticed their heads were hit with axes and their throats had been cut. They noticed several gaping gash wounds to Joseph's head. Side note, there are several accounts of Joseph being alive for a few days after being found by his brothers to only a few minutes, and I think the latter is true. Police were summoned and after investigating came up with the following conclusions. The panel to the door was carefully chiseled off to allow entry. The police believed this happened around 2 to 3 a.m. Joseph's safe was unlocked and empty, but a jewelry box was not touched, so the police ruled out robbery as a motive. The couple's throats were both cut with a barber's straight razor. Catherine's throat was cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her shoulders. She most likely asphyxiated on her own blood as she bled out immediately. The killer axed both of their heads several times with an axe before leaving. I wonder if he axed for permission first. The axe that was used to kill the victims was found in the bathtub, along with the bloody clothes in the bathroom, and this led police to believe the murderer changed clothes before leaving. Side note, again, there are differing reports of the axe's location. One account says the axe was found underneath the house, and other reports say it was found on or under the rear doorstep. I believe the bathtub to be the most likely spot that the axe was left, as the killer went into the bathroom to change his clothes before fleeing. The police thought it odd that brother Jake did not hear a break-in. Jake claimed he was drunk from celebrating before his upcoming departure in the Navy. But remember, the killer chiseled out a panel from the front door to gain entry, which was quiet enough to not even wake the occupants. After the bodies were removed, the straight razor that was used to slash the victims' throats was found in the neighbor's yard. It was a barber's straight razor. Side note, straight razors were invented in 17th century England and were the primary tool for manual shaving until the rise of the safety razor in the mid-20th century. Using a straight razor to murder was quite beneficial because you have more control of just how much of the blade contacts the skin. It also had more weight to it with a handle that would fold up as needed. So, as described, it would come in quite handy as a pocket-sized murder weapon. Andrew confessed that the murder weapon found a few houses down could have been his. This made him a prime suspect as he had no alibi. Andrew often used a razor at home to trim his own beard and even gifted them to family members. However, his employee, Esteban Torres, told police that Andrew removed the razor from his shop 2 days prior to the murder as he wanted to have a nick in the blade honed, which just means the blade had a chip or nick in it and needed repaired, which is honing. But Andrew was a barber and ruled out as a suspect, as a straight razor is a normal tool that a barber would need to operate. A few blocks from the murder scene, policemen had found a cryptic message chalked on the sidewalk. It read, "Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony." Now remember this, as I will be bringing it up later on in the episode as a possible tie to other murders possibly attributed to the same killer 6 years prior. Like I said, this is a complex case and there's so many pieces It's hard to put them all together, but I'm trying. Although the attack and murders of the Maggios are noted to be the first contributed to the not yet nicknamed the Axman of New Orleans, it most likely was not, as I will get to later. On June 27, 1918, on the corner of Dorgenois and La Harpe Streets, I won't be getting any French roles anytime soon either, another, quote, couple was attacked during the middle of the night. The couple was named Louis Bessemer, and he was with his mistress that evening, Harriet Anna Lowe. Louis was also an Italian grocer. The two were assaulted at the rear of his grocery store in the attached living quarters. They were found shortly after 7 a.m. by John Zonka as he was making a routine fresh goods delivery. John found both of them in a puddle of their own blood, which was coming from their heads. Louis later stated to police that he had been sleeping when he was struck in the head with a hatchet. Police concluded the following. Louis was struck with a small hatchet just above his right temple, which caused a possible skull fracture. Harriet Lowe was sliced over her left ear and left unconscious. Part of Harriet's face would be left paralyzed from the attack. Robbery was initially thought to be the motive, but no valuables were removed from the home. The hatchet, which had belonged to Louis, was found in the bathtub of the living quarters. Shortly after the attempted murder, Harriet Lowe stated that she remembered having been attacked by a mulatto man. Side note, this was an old-fashioned way that referred to a mixed race that includes white European and black African roots, in case you did not know. That song, Mulatto Butts, pretty catchy if you check it out. Anyway, so almost immediately, police arrested a potential suspect named Louis Ubicon. He was a 41-year-old African-American who had been employed in Louis Bessemer's store just a week before the attacks. Police arrested him based on Harriet's mulatto statement and his lack of alibi. However, Louis Ubicon was eventually released as police were unable to gather sufficient evidence to hold him accountable for the crimes. So the following events that occurred to the couple was like a Jerry Springer episode. If you aren't old enough to remember this show, I am embarrassed and sad because I'm getting old. It was a talk show that was basically a hillbilly circus show. Some guest stories seemed too unbelievable to be true. Louis Bessemer and Harriet Lowe would definitely be one of those sounds too unbelievable to be true episodes. Here is what happened. Harriet Lowe became the center of a media circus. She continually made scandalous and false statements regarding the attack and also against Louis Bessemer's character. The papers loved discovering that Harriet was a mistress and not the wife. His actual wife arrived from Cincinnati the days immediately after the attack. Harriet Lowe then gained more media attention because she reportedly complained about the New Orleans chief of police. Harriet Lowe also accused Louis as being a German spy. So, Bessemer was immediately arrested and police searched his home and discovered letters written in German, Russian, and Yiddish in a trunk. The media had a field day with this too. 2 days later, Louis Bessemer was released from custody and 2 lead investigators of the case were demoted due to unacceptable police work. After all, they did not take into account that Harriet Lowe suffered a head injury, and she had been in and out of consciousness in the hospital since the attack. In August of 1918, Harriet Lowe went in for surgery to repair her paralyzed face. That was a direct result of the attack. The surgery failed, and she died on August 5th. But that darn Harriet Lowe was still causing trouble after her death. Just before dying, she confessed that it was Louis Bessemer himself that attacked her with a hatchet. So, poor Louis Bessemer was arrested once again and charged with murder. He served 9 months in prison before being acquitted on May 1st, 1919, after a 10-minute jury deliberation. But before we get all judgy on Harriet Lowe, I do not know if she was a terrible person or not before the attack, but if not, the head injuries could explain her behavior. Side note, some do not think this attack on Louis Bessemer and Harriet Lowe was related to the Axman murders. Anna Schneider was attacked next on August 5th, 1918 on Elmira Street. It was late in the evening and she was sleeping when she awoke to see a dark figure standing over her, and then boom, she was bashed in the face repeatedly. Her scalp and face had been cut open and her face was completely covered in blood. Anna's husband, Ed, discovered her after midnight. He was working late that night. She did not remember anything after the attack. The attack caused Anna to go into early labor, and she gave birth to a healthy baby girl 2 days after the incident. Police concluded the following. The windows and doors of the apartment did not appear to have been forced open. Her attacker entered through an unlocked window. That Anna was most likely attacked with a lamp from a nearby table. Robbery was ruled out because Ed told police that nothing was stolen from the home except for $6 or $7 from his wallet. Now, me, myself, and I noticed 2 things strange about this attack. First being that Anna was attacked before midnight, which was much earlier in the evening than the other attacks. Could the attacker have intimate knowledge that her husband would be working late and that she would be home alone? The second being, if her husband Ed was at work during the attack, why was his wallet at home and not with him? As he told police, nothing was taken from the home except a few dollars from his wallet. Could her husband have been involved, possibly leaving the window unlocked? Dun dun dun! Police soon arrested a former convict named James Gleason. He was a 45-year-old African-American who raised suspicion when he ran after spotting the police. James explained that he ran because his previous experiences with the police did not go well and he was afraid of them. James was cleared of the attack. By the third attack, police began to speculate that these were not isolated incidents. The victims, for the majority, were Italian business owners. The assailant, who had now been dubbed the Axman of New Orleans, had targeted homes that were very similar in structure. They believed his weapon of choice was the victim's axe. However, he used a lamp to attack Sarah Lawman. Police suspected he would use any implement available inside the victim's home. The next attack occurred on August 10, 1918, on Tonty and Graver Streets. 2 sisters, 18-year-old Pauline and her younger sister, Mary Bruno, were sound asleep in the same bed when they awoke to the sound of screaming in the next room. The screaming was coming from their 80-year-old uncle, Joseph Romano, who was living with his nieces. When they entered his room, they saw a man standing over their uncle, and this man quickly fled. Their uncle was moaning and blood was all over the bedding. He had a serious axe blow to his head, resulting in 2 large gaping cuts. Although he was seriously injured, Joseph walked to the ambulance when it arrived. He died 2 hours after. The coroner listed his cause of death as fracture of vault of skull. Police concluded the following. A panel on the back door had been chiseled away. The home had been ransacked, but no items were stolen. A bloody axe was discovered in the backyard. The sisters were able to give the police a description of the man they saw standing over their uncle. He was a dark-skinned, heavy-set man who wore a dark suit and slouched hat. What I find ironic about this murder is that, like many residents of New Orleans, the sister had spent weeks reading the morbid newspaper accounts of the Axeman's attacks and feared that he would target their house one day, and he did. This makes me wonder if the sisters were sleeping in the same bed out of fear versus necessity. 2 days after Joseph Romano's murder, a funeral was held for him in the very house he was attacked. A reporter for the New Orleans Item, a newspaper, interviewed neighbors during the funeral and learned that most of them had not been sleeping at night. Some had been arming themselves for protection in addition to locking their doors. He would go on to write the headline, "Night has been turned into day for many Orleanians." By this time, hysteria was sweeping through the city, at least in the area known as Little Palermo. Families divided into watches and stood guard over their relatives as they slept. People did everything while holding on to a loaded shotgun, waiting for any news of Axman sightings. Of note, and to me, proof it wasn't all fear-induced imagination, on August 11th, 1918, the day after Romano was butchered, Al Durand awoke at his house on South Salcedo and Canal Streets. Durand lived alone and operated a saloon on the first floor of his house, about 10 blocks away from where Romano had lived. At some point on that Sunday morning, Durand stepped outside his house, and several foreign objects on the ground caught his eye. What were those objects? A large hatchet covered in grease, a screwdriver, and a .38 caliber cartridge. Durand looked at the door and found scratches from a screwdriver or a chisel. Apparently, his door was too thick to chisel through. He then spoke to his neighbors, who told him they had opened their windows when they heard the intruder in the night. The man had fled the scene. The police superintendent at the time was Frank Mooney. He was certain it was the Axman who paid Al Durand a visit. He urged people to share any tips about suspicious behavior, and he urged an anonymous man who had been sending him letters to come forward. On August 11th, the killer was seen in the neighborhood of Tulane and Broad, masquerading as a woman, the rumors said. A manhunt was organized, but without success. Later in August, the rear door of Paul Labella's grocery and residence was chiseled through. No one was home at the time. The same day, another grocer named Joseph LeBoeuf reported that an attempt had been made to chisel through his rear door in the night. Awakened by the noise, he had frightened the intruder away. An axe was discovered dropped on his steps. The following day, another axe was found in the yard of Mr. Recknagel on his back door. Search parties were organized, but unsuccessful. Whether these sightings were real or fear-induced, this state of panic alone resulted in 8 deaths and 10 injuries. So in a way, they too were indirect victims of the Axman. The Times-Picayune on August 16, 1918, wrote, "Superintendent of Police Mooney is anxious to meet the man who has been sending him advice through the mail about the Axman. The man, according to Mr. Mooney, appears to be well educated and a student of criminology. I am open at all times to suggestions," Mooney told the paper. "The letters I received from the man in question contained some valuable information, and I feel that a talk with him would help me in running down the criminal. I have spoken to several criminologists on the subject, but the letter writer appears to know more about crime and criminals than any of them." John D'Antonio, a then retired Italian detective, made public statements in which he theorized that the man who had committed the Axman murders was the same man who had killed several individuals in 1911. My personal opinion is that John D'Antonio was the anonymous person mailing advice about the Axman to the Superintendent of Police, Frank Mooney. D'Antonio described the potential killer as an individual of dual personalities who killed without motive. This type of individual, D'Antonio stated, could very likely have been a normal, law-abiding citizen who was often overcome by an overwhelming desire to kill. He later went on to describe the killer as a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Again, describing a serial killer before the word was created. The following are the attacks and murders between 1910 to 1912 that retired investigator D'Antonio thought the Axman of New Orleans, who had not received that moniker yet, began his crimes. On August 13, 1910, grocer John Cruddy and his wife Harriet awoke to a man demanding money. He brandished a meat cleaver and struck both in the head. Then he casually walked barefoot out of their home. A neighbor would testify that she saw a man carrying the couple's birdcage a few feet before releasing the mockingbird inside. He then put on his shoes and casually continued on his way. Fortunately, the couple survived. The next couple to be attacked was Joe and Marie Davy in June of 1911. They were also attacked with a hatchet. Joe was brutally beaten on the head and his brains were visible from the inflicted wounds. Joe Davy would pass away in the hospital the following day, but his pregnant wife Mary, who was just 16 years old, survived. He struck one more couple during this period on May 15, 1912. The couple was Tony Sciambra and his wife. He shot them both at close range. First he shot Tony and then killed his wife. And remember that cryptic message written in chalk found a few blocks from the Maggio's murder scene that said, "Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony"? This cryptic message is what retired Detective John D'Antonio believed tied this killer to these past events. The cryptic message was interpreted as a reference to this attack because Mrs. Sciambra was nicknamed Mrs. Tony by many of their customers. He also believed that ethnicity played a role in the killer's motive, as most of the victims were of Italian descent. Killer go to jail? We are now on to September 13th, 1918, when the Axman attempted another home invasion but could not succeed because objects were obstructing his way. You see, the Durrell family ran out of room and they had to stack all the cans that were in the way, and this saved the family. Prevent the Axman from accidentally did. The Cortimiglia family were the next to be attacked while sleeping on March 10, 1919. The family consisted of Charles, an Italian immigrant, his wife Rosie, and their infant daughter Mary. This family did not live in New Orleans, but in Gretna, which is a suburb across the Mississippi River. On the night of March 10, 1919, screams were heard coming from their house. Lorlando Giordano, a fellow neighbor and business competitor, went to the source of the screams and went inside their residence. Giordano found Charles, his wife Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary had all been attacked. Rosie stood in the doorway with a serious head wound. She was still clutching onto her 2-year-old dead daughter, who was sleeping in her mother's arms when the attack occurred. The little girl died from a single blow to the back of the neck. Charles lay on the floor and was bleeding profusely. The couple was rushed to Charity Hospital, where it was discovered that both had suffered skull fractures. Charles was released 2 days later, while his wife remained in the care of doctors. Police concluded the following: nothing was stolen from the house. A panel on the back door had been chiseled away. A bloody axe was found on the back porch of the home. Then what happened next was horrible. When Rosie gained consciousness, she made claims that Lorlando Giordano, the man who heard the screams and came to their aid, as well as his 18-year-old son, Frank, were responsible for the attacks. The father and son were arrested and charged with the attack and murder. The men would later be found guilty. Orlando was sentenced to life in prison, and Frank was sentenced to hang. This was absurd for the following reasons. The attack and murder fit the Axeman's M.O. Orlando was a 69-year-old man and too poor of health to have committed the crimes. Frank Giordano was more than 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed over 200 pounds. He would have been too large to have fit through the panel on the back door. Charles Cortimiglia, who was attacked at the same time, even vouched for the father and son and denied his wife's claims. He divorced Rosie after the trial because of this absurdity. And earlier in the episode, when I mentioned some history about the Italians and the vendetta, and there were tensions between many Italians and non-Italians, this is an example of problems with that. The police were wanting to just quickly write this off as just a vendetta attack. They didn't want to have anything to do with the case, even though it fit all of the Axeman's MO and everything. They just wanted nothing to do with it. They'd rather just blame it on the Italian vendetta. 9 months later, Rosie walked into the newspaper office of the Times-Picayune and retracted her testimony. She said that St. Joseph had come to her in a dream and told her she had to tell the truth. Rosie signed another affidavit, this time declaring that she hadn't seen her attackers and had been pressured into identifying the Giordanos. Despite Rosie's retraction, the prosecution didn't immediately give up. At one point, Rosie was threatened with perjury charges if she didn't stick to her original story. But finally, in December 1920, Rosie announced that she had falsely accused the two out of jealousy and spite, and they were released from prison. I cannot stand people who make false allegations that ruins people's lives. It still happens today. Cough, cough. The Duke Lacrosse team scandal? I would say she is an itch with a capital B, but what is unknown is her character before receiving severe head injuries, as head injuries can change a person. But regardless, these two men should never have been convicted in the first place, as her statement was the only evidence against the Giordanos. Rosie would go on to recover physically, however, mentally, she was never the same. The police were once again stumped, and rumblings began to suggest that perhaps the Axman really wasn't a man at all. Some claimed that he might be a woman or a midget, enabling him to slip through the small space that he cut in the doors. But others maintained that he was a creature from the world beyond or even a vampire. How else, they questioned, could all of the witnesses describe the killer as being a large man when only a small person could have slipped through the chiseled panels in the rear doors? The killer had to have come in through supernatural means, as each door was still locked when the attacks were discovered. The supernatural theory became, in their minds, more plausible with the Axeman's next attack. This would be the verbal attack written on March 13, 1919, when he sent his letter to the Times-Picayune to be printed the next day. The letter addressed to esteemed mortals of New Orleans and addressed from hell was the one I read to you in the beginning. So imagine waking up on the morning of March 14th, 1919, to read the paper, which is the equivalent to us looking at our phones, and you read the letter addressed to you. After all, you are a mortal of New Orleans. That would be scary, right? Wrong. Most people in New Orleans were not concerned. The Picayune didn't even publish the famous Axman letter on the front page. The letter ended up on the 18th page of the Sunday paper. The Axman targeted grocers, which were mostly immigrants, and most felt free from his threat. Many Southerners welcomed his reign of terror, considering the anti-immigrant sentiment after the death of Police Chief Hennessy, which was touted as a mafia hit, as I said earlier in the history lesson. Apparently, only to those in little Palermo, the news of the letter spread like an STD in an unprotected sexcapade. And as I said in the intro, the next Tuesday evening following the letter and into the early morning hours of the next day, thousands of homes blasted jazz music loud enough to be heard by any passerbys. Jazz clubs and dance halls were overflowing with people listening to jazz music, and those who did not own home stereos packed themselves into jazz clubs and lounges or held block parties. Even Joseph Davila, a well-known local composer, created the theme song for the night. He titled his composition The Mysterious Axman's Jazz, and it became a huge hit. In fact, because of this letter, several jazz songs were named after the Axman. The Axman kept his promise. No mortal of New Orleans died that night, at least not by an axe, and those not concerned with being a victim of the Axman ridiculed people who played jazz that night. The next attack occurred on August 10th, 1919. Steve Boca, a grocer, was sleeping in his bedroom when he woke up and saw an intruder holding an axe over his bed. The next thing he remembers is regaining consciousness and running to the street to look for the intruder. He ran to his neighbor Frank Janusa's house, where he lost consciousness and collapsed. His injuries were the most severe of the living victims. His skull was cracked open, exposing his brain. Steve Boca recovered from his injuries, but could not remember any details of the trauma. Police concluded the following: like a broken record, the panel on the back door of the home had been chiseled away. Nothing had been taken from the home. On September 2nd, a local druggist named William Carson escaped the lethal Axman when he fired several shots at an intruder who had broken into his home. The killer left a broken door and an axe behind. On the night of September 3rd, 1919, Sarah Lawman was attacked. Neighbors, knowing the woman who was only 19 years old and lived alone, came to check on her. When she did not answer to knocks and calling out her name, they broke into her home and discovered the young woman lying unconscious on her bed and bleeding profusely. Her head was split open and several teeth knocked out. Sarah survived despite the severity of her injuries. Like the others, she couldn't remember the attack. Police concluded the following: the intruder had entered the apartment through an open window. Sarah was attacked with a blunt object. A bloody axe was discovered on the front lawn of the building. On October 27, 1919, Esther Pepitone heard noises coming from her bedroom. She ran in just in time to see two men running from the scene. Her husband, Mike Pepitone, lay dead in his bed. He was struck in the head and blood was on the body and also splattered all over the room. Esther Pepitone was unable to describe any characteristics of the killer. This couple had 6 kids. I am guessing she was not sleeping in the same bed with her husband due to having 6 children and was probably sleeping with one of them. Who knows, but it most likely saved her life. Police concluded that Mike Pepitone was smashed with an iron bar, which was used as an impromptu weapon because Pepitone didn't own an axe. The coroner reported he was struck in the head 18 times and his face had been warped into an unrecognizable mass. Then, just as quickly as the Axman could break into a house and bludgeon its occupants, the attacks stopped. Or did they? I will get into more murders possibly committed by the Axman, as well as suspects and theories on the next episode. Until next time, have a good evening. the Cortimiglia, the Cortimiglia, the Cortimiglia, the Cortimiglia, the Cortimiglia family, the Cortimiglia family, the Cortimiglia fam, the Cortimiglia, the Cortimiglia, the Cortimiglia, the Cortimiglia, the Cortimiglia family, the Cortimiglia family.